Hello and welcome to the channel. Have you ever heard of George Orwell? He was a British writer whose sharp insight into political control has made his work timeless. His most famous book, 1984, is a chilling portrayal of a totalitarian world where every thought is monitored and every truth is rewritten. In Chapter 1, we meet Winston Smith, a solitary man living under the oppressive gaze of Big Brother. But here's the question. In a world where even your thoughts betray you, can rebellion still begin with a whisper? On a cold, grim April's day in Airstrip 1, once known as London, Winston Smith returns to his dismal flat in Victory Mansions, dodging the bitter wind and carrying with him the weariness of a life under constant surveillance. The clocks strike 13, a symbol of the twisted reality he inhabits. Posters of a stern-faced man with a black mustache glare from every corner, accompanied by the ominous words, "Big Brother is watching you." Even within the safety of his flat, Winston cannot escape. A telescreen on the wall broadcasts endless statistics and propaganda and simultaneously monitors his every move, a chilling reminder that privacy no longer exists. Winston, a frail man of 39, moves about his apartment cautiously. He lives in a society where even facial expressions must be curated, for a glance of discontent might be enough to provoke suspicion. In the world of 1984, thought itself is policed. The thought police lurk invisibly, and their presence is felt more than seen. The telescreens record not just sounds, but also images, rendering every movement suspect. As he gazes out of the window, Winston takes in a city in decay. Once grand buildings now rot, patched with timber and tin, surrounded by rubble and poverty. Bomb sites have turned into makeshift slums. Helicopters hover like insects, peering into people's homes. Yet none of this surprises him anymore. It is the unchanging gray backdrop of his reality. The ministries, in contrast, rise above the city like monoliths of power. The Ministry of Truth, where Winston works, towers in white majesty, broadcasting party slogans. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. The irony embedded in these phrases reflects the psychological control the party wields. There are 4 such ministries, each a grotesque inversion of its name. The Ministry of Truth spreads lies. The Ministry of Peace perpetuates war. The Ministry of Love tortures dissenters. And the Ministry of Plenty orchestrates scarcity. Of all these, the Ministry of Love is the most terrifying. With no windows and guards patrolling with truncheons, it exists only for punishment and fear. Inside his modest kitchen, Winston reflects on the absence of food. Victory gin, harsh and oily, is all that remains. Still, he steels himself with a gulp, bracing for what he's about to do. From a hidden drawer, he pulls out a forbidden object, a beautiful old diary. The creamy paper, aged but inviting, seduced him from a junk shop window, and despite knowing the risk, he purchased it, a rebellious act in itself. With trembling hands, he prepares to write. The use of pen and ink, nearly forgotten in this world of mechanical dictation, feels sacred. It is not illegal to keep a diary. There are no laws anymore, but the consequences are clear. Death or 25 years in a labor camp. He dips the pen and begins. With those first shaky words, April 4th, 1984, he commits a thought crime, not in speech or action, but on paper. It is the beginning of his silent defiance, a whisper against the thunder of control. On a cold and colorless April afternoon, Winston Smith returns to his crumbling flat in Victory Mansions, navigating the bitter wind like a man trying to avoid being seen by the very air itself. The clocks strike 13, a small but haunting sign that in this world, even time has been altered, rebranded to suit the needs of control. As Winston slips inside, dust follows him in, as if even the city's grime refuses to remain outside. In this world, nothing is private, not even the act of entering one's own home. All around him, images of a heavy-browed, mustachioed man gaze from enormous posters with the words, "Big Brother is watching you." These are not merely signs, they are signals, reminders that the state does not sleep. Even within his apartment, a place that might once have offered solitude, Winston is not alone. The telescreen on his wall does more than speak. It listens, it sees, it watches. It cannot be turned off. It whispers state propaganda while silently waiting for Winston to blink the wrong way, sigh too deeply, or linger too long in thought. Here, the walls have ears and the ceilings have eyes. Orwell constructs a world not where privacy is eroded, but where it has vanished altogether. The omnipresent surveillance is not just external, it has become internalized. People monitor themselves. A raised eyebrow can be a crime. A flicker of doubt is an act of treason. In Oceania, there is no refuge, no hiding place, not even in one's own mind. Winston, a thin, wary man of 39, moves with the caution of someone who knows that existence is a performance. Every action, every glance must be curated, rehearsed. Even his expression is not his own. It must be worn like a mask. A single grimace of disapproval could be his undoing. The thought police are not simply enforcers of behavior. They are guardians of emotion, tyrants of the imagination. In this world, thought itself is a battleground, and Winston knows he is already losing. He looks out of his window and sees a city in ruins. Once grand buildings are now patched with timber and rusted iron. Entire blocks, bombed into dust, have become slums of leaning walls and makeshift huts. Helicopters flutter above like mechanical insects, darting between rooftops, peering into lives. There is nothing vibrant, nothing alive, except for the faces of Big Brother, which haunt every street corner, every wall, every thought. And above it all loom the ministries. Vast, gleaming monoliths of white concrete, impossible to ignore. The Ministry of Truth, where Winston works, towers over the city like a cathedral of lies. It proclaims the party's three sacred slogans. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. These are not paradoxes for reflection. They are mantras designed to dismantle logic, to wear down resistance. If one is forced to believe that freedom is slavery, then the very concept of freedom collapses. Winston lives in a world where language has been hollowed out, where words have been stripped of meaning and then repurposed to serve the machinery of control. The Ministry of Peace manages war. The Ministry of Plenty enforces scarcity. The Ministry of Love, where no windows exist and guards wield truncheons, is the place of torture and terror. Its name is the cruelest of ironies, a reminder that in this world, nothing is what it seems. Language no longer reveals truth, it conceals it. And yet, amidst this vast machinery of manipulation, a moment of stillness appears. Winston, alone in his kitchen, eyes a stale crust of bread and a bottle of Victory gin. The gin, harsh and bitter, is a parody of comfort. It numbs rather than nourishes. But even this moment of deprivation is interrupted, not by hunger, but by resolve. Winston is about to do something wondrous, something unwise, something human. From a hidden drawer, he retrieves an old, beautiful diary. Its creamy, yellowed pages speak of a time before oppression, before words were poison. He had bought it in secret, moved by a sudden and irrational desire. And now, under the shadow of fear, he prepares to write, not to anyone else. Not for the world, but for himself. In a society where even thinking can be a crime, to write is to rebel. It is not illegal because there are no laws, but Winston knows the truth. To keep a diary is to declare independence. It is to preserve memory. To believe that one's thoughts are worth the ink they require is to defy the party. It is to say quietly but clearly, I exist. He fits a nib into the pen, dips it in ink, and writes, April 4th, 1984. That date, simple as it may seem, marks the beginning of something profound. It is not a revolution, not yet, but it is a whisper of resistance, a ripple against the tide, a signal that even in this world of total surveillance, a single human soul can still dare to be free. This moment, this silent, trembling act, reveals the core message of Orwell's vision, that totalitarianism seeks not just to rule the body, but to conquer the mind. And that the greatest rebellion is not in shouting, but in remembering, in thinking and writing. In today's world, Orwell's warning echoes louder than ever. Surveillance no longer takes the form of telescreens, but of data harvesting, camera networks, and algorithms that know us better than we know ourselves. We carry the telescreen in our pockets in the form of phones that track our movements, predict our behavior, and offer us comfort in exchange for submission. But the deeper danger remains, not that someone watches us, but that we forget we are worth watching, that we abandon reflection, that we surrender the right to ask, is this true? Is this just? Is this mine? Winston's act reminds us that resistance begins within. It begins with noticing, with asking, with the sacred, solitary act of writing a single true sentence, even if it must remain hidden. And so Orwell does not merely describe a bleak future, he hands us a mirror and asks, where are you in this story? Are you watching or being watched? Are you remembering or forgetting? Because in the end, the world does not change through speeches or battles. It changes in quiet rooms, where someone dares to tell the truth, to themselves first of all. In the smallest act of courage, in the flicker of a thought not yet silenced, lies the seed of everything we hope to preserve: freedom, dignity, and the right to one's own mind. Because in the end, the world does not change through speeches or battles. It changes in quiet rooms, where someone dares to tell the truth, to themselves first of all. In the smallest act of courage, in the flicker of a thought not yet silenced, lies the seed of everything we hope to preserve: freedom, dignity, and the right to one's own mind. And from that seed, a question begins to grow, one not only for Winston Smith, but for each of us. Winston Smith sat back from his diary, a deep sense of helplessness descending over him like a fog. Even the year 1984 felt uncertain. He guessed it might be around that time, since he believed himself to be 39 and born in 1904 or 1945, but exact dates had long since become blurry in this world where history was rewritten, facts rearranged, and time itself dissolved into propaganda. And as he stared at the blank page, the gravity of what he was attempting fully hit him. For whom was he writing? For the unborn, for the future. Yet how could the future possibly understand him? If it were like the present, it would be blind to his truth. If it were different, his struggles might no longer be relevant. Either way, he was scribbling into a void. The telescreen blasted military music, drowning his thoughts. Winston had been preparing for this moment for weeks, perhaps years, thinking that all he needed was courage. But now, sitting before the paper, even the internal monologue that had once flowed so freely in his mind had vanished. All that remained was noise, the scream of the telescreen, the itchy discomfort of his varicose ulcer, the blur of gin in his system. Then, almost without awareness, panic took over, and he began to write, not thoughts, but a raw, chaotic memory of the previous night's film showing. War propaganda, grotesque images of refugees bombed at sea, a child's arm flying through the air, the audience laughing. Except for one woman, a prole, who protested, only to be silenced and removed. Typical prole reaction that he noted bitterly, detached and wounded at once. Then, as if through the process of writing, another memory surfaced, one that had truly prompted him to begin the diary that day. It had taken place earlier that morning at the ministry during preparations for the daily ritual known as the 2 minutes hate. As chairs were arranged, two people entered the room, strangers in title, but familiar to Winston by sight. One was a dark-haired girl, athletic and sharp-eyed, dressed in party overalls in a scarlet sash, emblem of the Junior Anti-Sex League. Her youthful pureness repelled him, not just because she seemed loyal to the party, but because she represented everything that had been denied him: freedom, desire, connection. The second figure was O'Brien, a member of the inner party. Large, intelligent-looking, with a brutal yet strangely civilized manner, O'Brien had long captivated Winston. He harbored a private hope that O'Brien's orthodoxy wasn't perfect, that perhaps he saw more than he let on. Though Winston had never spoken to him, there lingered a quiet belief that if anyone could understand the silent rebellion brewing within him, it might be O'Brien. As the hate began, Goldstein's face, emblem of betrayal and heresy, flashed on the screen. The atmosphere in the room thickened into a frenzy. Screams, curses, even objects thrown at the screen. It was a terrifying blend of fear, hatred, and ritualized violence. A tidal wave of emotion that swept everyone into its grip. Even Winston found himself participating, kicking his chair, shouting, shaking with rage. Not just at Goldstein, but at everything. At one moment, he hated the party, the thought police. In another, he adored Big Brother as a protector against imagined threats. This emotional whiplash was the essence of party control: to ignite passions and redirect them, effortlessly and without logic. Hatred became a tool, not merely for repression, but for cohesion. And it could be aimed at anyone, even a girl behind him. Winston's thoughts turned violent and erotic, full of frustration and disgust. The very desire he could not express became twisted, a reflection of a society that weaponized chastity and suppressed intimacy. The hate peaked as Goldstein's face morphed into that of a Eurasian soldier, gun raised, advancing with terrifying speed, only to dissolve into the calm, commanding image of Big Brother. His face filled the screen, vast and still, offering no distinct words, just presence. The room erupted into the rhythmic chant, "Babi! Bibi!" The sound was primal, ritualistic, more hypnotic than patriotic. It was part hymn, part spell, designed not to stir thought, but to drown it. Winston, like the others, joined in. He had no choice. To hesitate, even slightly, was to risk exposure. But deep inside, coldness took root. The chant filled him with horror. Yet it was in this moment, this convergence of fear, hatred, and artificial ecstasy, that something strange occurred. He caught O'Brien's gaze. Their eyes met. For a brief second, Winston believed, no, he knew, that O'Brien understood. There was a message in that look. I am with you. But like everything in Oceania, the moment vanished. The look could have been imagined. Nothing followed. No words were exchanged. Winston returned to his cubicle, his mind buzzing with doubt and longing. Was there truly a brotherhood? Did the book exist? Or was he simply projecting his hope onto shadows? In a world without evidence, where truth was vapor and memory was treason, such fleeting glances became precious. In the silence of conformity, they whispered possibility. And for Winston Smith, that was enough, for now. Winston Smith sat alone, blank paper before him, and a sense of helplessness settled over his chest like a thick, unmoving fog. Even the year, 1980, was uncertain. He could only guess it from the fading memories of his birth year, 1944 or 1945. In a world where dates were rewritten and history was constantly reshaped, certainty was a luxury long lost. As he stared down at the empty page, he found himself asking a question that had no clear answer. For whom was he writing this diary? For the unborn, for a future that might never arrive. He knew with a quiet despair that if the future resembled the present, it would not understand him, and if it did not resemble the present, then his words would be meaningless. Still, he wrote, not with clarity but in a sudden panic, spurred by the oppressive weight of silence and uncertainty. The telescreen had begun blaring harsh military music. His varicose ulcer itched. The gin he had consumed left a sickly warmth in his body, and all of it conspired to muddle his mind. Yet his hand moved. His pen scratched across the page in clumsy letters. What came out was not a structured thought, but a chaotic recollection of the previous night's film. It was a war documentary, scenes of refugees being bombed at sea, a child's body blown into the air, and an audience erupting in laughter. All except for one woman, a prole who objected to what she saw. They didn't oughter have showed it. Not in front of kids, she had cried, but she was swiftly silenced, dismissed. Winston noted the moment with cold detachment, typical prole reaction. And yet there was something in it that lingered. The writing unearthed more than memory. It stirred something deeper, an earlier event from that very morning that had, he now realized, pushed him to begin this diary at all. During preparations for the daily ritual of the 2 minutes hate, Winston had seen two familiar yet distant figures, a young, dark-haired woman with a bold, athletic air, and O'Brien, a high-ranking member of the inner party. The girl repelled him, not merely for her scarlet sash of the Junior Anti-Sex League, but for the cold purity and loyal conformity she represented. She symbolized everything he hated and feared, and perhaps everything he desired but had been denied. O'Brien, by contrast, fascinated him. Though powerful and imposing, there was something disarmingly civilized in his demeanor, a manner that whispered possibility. Winston didn't know him, had never spoken to him, but he held a persistent, irrational hope that O'Brien's orthodoxy was not absolute, that perhaps behind those eyes there was someone who thought as he did. Then the hate began. The image of Emmanuel Goldstein, the party's declared enemy, appeared on the telescreen. A wave of noise, fury, and ritualized anger erupted across the room. The audience shouted, cursed, even threw objects. Winston, too, felt himself swept up in the storm. It was a terrifying display, not just of emotion, but of control. The image of Goldstein's face, combined with the pounding rhythm of marching soldiers, stirred a violent frenzy in everyone present. Even Winston, who tried to resist the wave, found himself stomping, shouting, consumed by rage. But his hatred was not fixed. It shifted. One moment he loathed Goldstein. The next, he found himself silently siding with him, the lone voice of reason in a world gone mad. And just as suddenly, he adored Big Brother, the supposed protector of peace and order. The hate was not about clarity or truth. It was about surrender, the transformation of thought into instinct. And in this world, that instinct had been trained to hate, to cheer violence, to suppress every inner whisper of doubt. In the middle of it all, Winston's thoughts turned against the girl behind him. He didn't just resent her political purity. He resented her youth, her beauty, her unreachability. Repressed desire twisted into fantasies of dominance and destruction. It wasn't love. It wasn't even lust. It was a mirror of what the party had done to him, warped every natural emotion into something twisted, something weaponized. Then, in a single moment, the screen shifted. Goldstein vanished. In his place appeared the face of Big Brother, calm, powerful, eternal. No words were needed. The crowd exhaled in relief as though salvation had come, and the chant began, "Ba-bee, be-bee." It rolled through the room like thunder, rhythmic, hypnotic. It was more than praise, it was surrender. Winston chanted too, because not doing so would mark him. But inside he felt cold, empty, terrified. And then it happened, barely a flicker, but enough to change everything. O'Brien caught his eye, their gazes locked. In that instant, Winston believed, no, he knew, that O'Brien saw him, understood him. "I am with you," O'Brien's eyes seemed to say. "I know your hatred, your doubt. I share it." But just as quickly, the moment vanished. O'Brien looked away. His face returned to impassivity. The connection, if it had ever existed, dissolved. Winston returned to his cubicle. He said nothing. He looked at nothing. But the glance lingered. It became something to hold on to in a world where nothing was solid, where truth itself was vapor. Perhaps it had meant nothing. Perhaps it had been imagined. But for Winston, it became a symbol, not of revolution, but of human connection. In a society that silenced every true emotion, even a shared glance became sacred. He thought of the brotherhood, of the book. Were they real? Were they myths? It no longer mattered. The belief itself gave him something the party could not extinguish: hope. It flickered, fragile but real, like the ink drying on the first page of his diary. That page might never be read. The thoughts it contained might never spark anything beyond his own mind. And yet, it was enough, because in the deep, locked loneliness of his existence, Winston had acted. He had written. He had remembered. He had resisted. Winston Smith sat alone with a blank page before him, the pen trembling in his fingers, and an oppressive silence surrounding his thoughts. He wasn't even certain what year it was. The number 1984 lingered more like an approximation than a truth. In a world where history was rewritten daily and facts were endlessly malleable, time had lost its solidity. He guessed he was 39, born around 1904 or 1901, but even that knowledge felt vague, wrapped in layers of doubt. What struck him more deeply, however, was the question that suddenly formed in his mind. For whom was he writing? For the unborn? For some distant future? And if that future ever came, would it even understand him? If it resembled the present, then it would be just as blind, just as mute. If it was different, his pain might seem absurd, irrelevant. Either way, he feared he was writing into a void, unheard and unread. Still, something inside him insisted on writing. But as he stared at the page, the flow of thoughts he had expected, the quiet monologue that had been building in him for years, suddenly vanished. He had imagined this moment for so long, assuming the act of writing would be simple, natural. But now, with the telescreen blaring militaristic noise and the acrid taste of gin still burning in his throat, he found himself drowning in confusion. Even his body turned against him. The ulcer above his ankle itched unbearably, and he dared not scratch it. His mind was a storm of nothingness. Then, in a moment of panic, his hand moved and he began to write, without clarity, without intention. Just raw, unfiltered memory spilling onto the page. The memory was grotesque. A war film he had seen the previous night. Images of a fat man flailing in the water as a helicopter chased him, bullets riddling his body until he sank. The crowd in the theater had laughed at his death. A boat filled with frightened children and a woman trying to shield a boy from the inevitable explosion. Then a blast, wood shattered, and the sight of a child's arm flying into the air, followed by applause from the party members. One woman, a prole, had protested faintly, but no one had cared. She was removed without ceremony. Typical prole reaction, Winston wrote, trying to sound detached, but he wasn't. The memory had left a mark, though he wasn't sure why. As the ink dried, another scene surfaced, clearer than the last. That morning in the Ministry of Truth, during preparations for the daily 2 minutes hate, Winston had seen two people. One, a girl with dark hair and a scarlet sash wrapped tightly around her waist, and the other, O'Brien, a member of the inner party. The girl stirred a visceral reaction in him. She was athletic, efficient, cold. Her very presence seemed to radiate loyalty, discipline, and sexual repression. Everything about her symbolized the party's ideal of chastity and conformity. He hated her, and in some twisted, painful way, he also wanted her. But more than that, he feared her. She might be watching him. She might be one of them. O'Brien, on the other hand, awakened something else entirely. He was large, confident, brutal in appearance, but oddly refined in demeanor. Winston had never spoken to him, but he felt drawn to the man. There was something behind O'Brien's eyes that made Winston wonder. Was he really loyal to the party? Was there a crack, even a hairline one, in his ideological mask? Winston had no proof, only hope. And in a world starved of trust, even a vague hope became a powerful anchor. The ritual began. Goldstein's face appeared on the telescreen, and with it came the tidal wave of orchestrated fury. Screams, objects thrown, obscenities shouted from every corner of the room. The hate was immediate, engulfing. But what shocked Winston was not how the others behaved. It was how quickly he too became one of them. His body reacted before his thoughts could catch up. Rage, deep and hot, surged through him. He shouted, kicked, cursed, not because he had to pretend, but because the ritual made him feel it. That was the true horror. The party didn't just force performance, it made performance real. His hatred spun wildly. One moment he loathed Goldstein, the next he hated the girl behind him. His mind flooded with violent fantasies, twisted with longing and disgust. He imagined harming her, dominating her, even killing her. Not because she had done anything, but because she was young and pure and beautiful, and he could never touch her. His desire, buried and denied, had turned into something dark and desperate. In that moment, he understood. When love is forbidden, it does not vanish. It mutates. Then the screen changed. Goldstein was gone. In his place, Big Brother's face appeared. Calm, stern, all-powerful. The room sighed. The chaos turned to worship. A chant began, "Babi, Bibi." The sound was slow, rhythmic, hypnotic. It was less a celebration than a trance. Winston joined in. He had no choice. To abstain was suicide. But even as he chanted, a cold horror crawled inside him. This was not praise, it was erasure, a drowning of the self. He could feel it happening. And then, in the eye of that storm, something broke the rhythm. He looked up. O'Brien had risen slightly in his seat. Their eyes met. For a single, unmistakable second, something passed between them. An understanding, a recognition. Winston felt it as surely as he had ever felt anything. "I am with you," O'Brien's eyes seemed to say. "I know, I see, I understand." The moment was gone in an instant, but it remained. A flicker of connection in a world engineered to destroy it. Winston returned to his work. The glance had left no trace, no consequence. Perhaps it had never happened. Perhaps he had imagined it. But even if it was a fantasy, it was enough. Enough to believe that he wasn't completely alone. Enough to make him right. Enough to remind him that inside his mind, untouched by the party, at least for now, there was still something real. The possibility of the brotherhood stirred again in his thoughts. The forbidden book, the resistance. Were they myths? Propaganda? It didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling that they might exist, that someone, somewhere, still remembered what freedom felt like, that someone still thought as he thought. In Oceania, there were no certainties, only doubts. And in those doubts, Winston found something resembling faith. So he continued to write, not with confidence, not even with clarity, but with a kind of sacred desperation. He had begun something dangerous, something forbidden. But in doing so, he had also reclaimed a piece of himself. In a world where the party sought to own not just actions, but emotions, not just speech, but memory, to write was to resist. To remember was to fight. To feel was to rebel. And in the stillness of that room, under the eyes of the telescreen with the echoes of chants still lingering in the air, Winston Smith, the invisible man in a gray uniform, had taken the first true step not just toward rebellion, but toward remembering what it meant to be human. Winston's first entry in the diary, confused, clumsy, and filled with contradiction, is not simply a moment of personal release. It is a moment of awakening. In a society where language is twisted, where emotion is weaponized, and where history is a lie, the very act of remembering becomes resistance. His words might never be read. His thoughts might vanish with him. But the act of writing them means something. It means he still believes he is real. That truth still matters. That freedom, even if imagined, is worth the risk. We do not live in Oceania, but we live in a world where distraction replaces reflection, where noise drowns out silence, and where truth is often negotiated, not honored. Winston's struggle urges us to ask, do we still notice when something feels wrong? Do we still believe our private thoughts matter? Do we still dare to feel deeply, quietly, when the world tells us not to? Because the beginning of all freedom is not in revolt, but in awareness. Not in shouting, but in remembering. Not in overthrowing the system, but in reclaiming the self. Even a whisper can be an act of defiance. Winston stirred and straightened his posture, a belch escaping his lips as the gin worked its way upward. His eyes drifted back to the diary, and to his surprise, he realized that while his mind had been wandering, his hand had continued writing, almost unconsciously. What now filled the page wasn't the awkward scrawl he had begun with, but bold capital letters, repeated over and over, "Down with Big Brother." The phrase stretched halfway down the page, a mechanical confession from deep within his psyche. Panic rose in him. Writing those words wasn't technically more dangerous than opening the diary in the first place, but seeing them so naked on the page, so clear and deliberate, made the act feel irreversible. For a moment, he considered ripping the pages out and abandoning the whole effort. But he didn't, because deep down, he understood the futility. Whether he wrote the words or not, whether he continued the diary or not, the outcome was already fixed. The thought police would get him anyway. The crime was not the writing, it was the thinking. Thought crime was inevitable once conceived, and though it might go undetected for a while, the end was always the same. Eventually, they always came for you. He pictured it clearly. The arrest, always in the dead of night, always sudden, no trial, no records, just disappearance. People were vaporized, erased from existence. The word itself had a cold, clinical precision. One moment you were a citizen, a comrade. The next, no one remembered you had ever been. In a fit of almost hysterical defiance, Winston began scribbling again, messily this time, the words tumbling from him in a blur. "They'll shoot me. I don't care, they always shoot you in the back of the neck. I don't care down with Big Brother." The writing, frantic and uneven, seemed to spill from a deeper place than reason. When he finally stopped, he laid down the pen and sat back, ashamed and startled by his own outburst. Then, a knock, a sharp, undeniable knock at the door. For an agonizing moment, Winston sat frozen. The knocking came again. He forced himself up, heart racing, praying that it wasn't the thought police. As he reached for the doorknob, his gaze flicked back to the open diary on the table. Down with Big Brother, still wet on the page, visible across the room. He hadn't closed it, too afraid of smudging the ink. But it was too late for regrets now. When he opened the door, relief flooded him. It wasn't the thought police. It was Mrs. Parsons, a tired, worn woman from the neighboring flat. Her voice was frail and apologetic. Her kitchen sink was blocked. Could he come take a look? She looked older than her 30-some years, a woman dulled by hardship and party life. Winston followed her through the dim corridor of Victory Mansions, the plaster crumbling around them, the smell of cabbage and decay hanging in the air. Her flat was bigger, but even more worn than his, filled with the chaotic energy of 2 children and the suffocating presence of party paraphernalia. Banners, slogans, and of course, a giant poster of Big Brother. The room reeked of sweat and boiled food, and the atmosphere felt not just disordered, but vaguely hostile. Someone was in another room whistling along with the telescreen's military music using a comb and tissue paper. Mrs. Parsons, distracted and anxious, explained that her husband Tom, Winston's co-worker at the ministry, was out. Tom Parsons was the model of party loyalty, dense, enthusiastic, entirely unquestioning. He was the sort of man the regime could rely on completely, more dangerous in his stupidity than any trained spy. Winston disliked him intensely. Winston knelt by the sink and began clearing the blockage. He hated manual work, especially anything that required him to kneel or bend, as it triggered coughing fits. But he forced himself through it. When he finished and returned to the living room, he was ambushed. "Up with your hands!" shouted a boy's voice. It was Parsons' son, pointing a toy pistol at him with wild-eyed intensity. The little girl followed, mimicking her brother with a shard of wood. Dressed in the uniforms of the spies, the party's youth organization, they hurled accusations. "Traitor! Thought criminal! Eurasian spy!" Their eyes gleamed, their excitement disturbingly real. It wasn't a game. There was cruelty in the boy's voice, in his posture. Winston raised his hands, trying to smile, but the moment chilled him. These were children raised to hate, to report, to attack. Mrs. Parsons tried to downplay it. "They're disappointed," she explained nervously. "They couldn't go to the hanging." A public execution of Eurasian prisoners was scheduled for that evening, a regular spectacle. The children had wanted to attend. When Winston left, he was barely down the hall before something struck the back of his neck with sharp pain. The boy had shot him with a catapult. As the door closed behind the child, he screamed one last word, "Goldstein!" What lingered for Winston, however, was not the pain, but the look of fear on Mrs. Parsons' face. She was terrified of her own children. Back in his flat, Winston sat again at the table, rubbing his neck as the telescreen switched from music to military announcements. News came of a new floating fortress deployed near Iceland, and Winston, only half listening, returned to his thoughts. With children like the Parsons, the party had its strongest grip. Through youth organizations like the Spies, it was raising entire generations to betray, to conform, to police their own parents. There was no natural rebellion in them. On the contrary, they adored the party. All their excitement, all their ferocity was channeled against the party's enemies, real or imagined. Adults feared their children now, and for good reason. The papers were always praising child heroes who turned in their families for unorthodoxy. The pain in Winston's neck faded, and with it the energy to keep writing. But his thoughts drifted again to O'Brien. Years ago, he had dreamed of O'Brien's voice telling him, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness." The words had seemed trivial in the dream, but over time they had taken on meaning. Winston had since come to believe the voice had indeed been O'Brien's. Whether he was friend or enemy seemed less important than the strange bond he felt, an understanding, even if unspoken. The telescreen broke in with a trumpet blast and a news bulletin. Victory in South India, great triumph. The war might soon be over. Then, as expected, the real news. The chocolate ration would be reduced from 30 grams to 20. Winston burped again. The gin was wearing off, and the national anthem blared from the telescreen in celebration, masking the bitter truth of scarcity with booming patriotism. He turned toward the window, back to the screen, and looked out over the cold city. Far away, a rocket bomb exploded. Another week, another 20 or 30 would fall. Below, a torn poster flapped in the wind, revealing and concealing the word I Ingsoc, the party's ideology, the sacred principles of Ingsoc, newspeak, doublethink, the mutability of the past. He felt adrift, lost in a world that twisted truth and memory. Who was on his side? Was there even one person? He feared that the party's dominion would last forever. He took a coin from his pocket. On one side, Big Brother's face. On the other, the same slogans from the Ministry of Truth. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. The eyes were everywhere. On coins, stamps, posters, books. You could never escape them. There was no corner of life untouched. Nothing was your own, except the few centimeters inside your skull. Outside, the light had shifted. The Ministry of Truth now looked like a dark fortress, impenetrable. Winston's heart sank before it. It was too strong. Nothing could destroy it. Not bombs, not protests, not even truth. He returned to his diary, still unsure who he was writing for. The future, the past, an imagined age of freedom. It didn't matter. All that lay ahead was annihilation. The thought police would read it, then erase it, erase him, and yet he continued, not to be heard, but to remain sane. Writing was an act of survival. To the future or to the past, he wrote, to a time when thought is free, from the age of Big Brother, greetings. He realized then he was already dead. The moment he had begun thinking freely, he had sealed his fate. Thought crime was not the beginning of death. It was death itself. From now on, his goal was simply to stay alive as long as he could. He washed the ink from his hands, careful not to leave a trace. Even a stain could betray him. Before closing the diary, he carefully placed a speck of dust on the cover. If it was disturbed, he would know someone had looked. It was a feeble act of protection, but it was something. In a world built on lies, every small truth was a fortress, and this was his. Winston Smith's moment of alarm, sparked by his unconscious repetition of "down with Big Brother," is more than a lapse of control. It is a glimpse into the fractured psyche of a man trying to retain sanity in a world where sanity itself is outlawed. The phrase emerges not from rebellion born of courage, but from the deeply buried self that has been silenced for so long that when it speaks, it does so with uncontrollable urgency. He discovered that while he sat helplessly musing, he had also been writing. The subconscious had moved faster than thought. The act of writing, automatic and unplanned, reveals the unavoidable truth. Winston's defiance was never theoretical. It had already begun in the deepest folds of his mind. In that moment, he considers abandoning the diary, perhaps even destroying it. But he quickly realizes that nothing he does now can alter the outcome. Whether he wrote "down with Big Brother" or whether he refrained from writing it made no difference. This is the heart of Orwell's warning. In a truly totalitarian regime, even silence is not safety. Once thought deviates from orthodoxy, even in private, it becomes a crime. That crime is not measured by actions, but by intent. Thought crime. The body can conform, the speech can parrot, but if the mind rebels, the end is inevitable. The party's genius lies in its dismantling of time itself. History is mutable. The future is unknowable. Truth is vapor, and without temporal anchor, fear is ever present. Winston recalls with chilling clarity how arrests always occur at night. People simply disappeared, always during the night. These are not memories of fiction, but lived horror. The language, abolished, annihilated, vaporized, is sterile, and that sterility is terrifying. It reduces the complexity of a human life to a technical procedure. The very idea of justice is erased. What is left is fear, and more than that, erasure. Not death, but non-existence. Winston's breakdown, his frantic scrawl, his repetition of "they'll shoot me in the back of the neck," exposes the deeper trauma. He knows the mechanics of punishment. He knows the outcome. But what disturbs him more is the knowledge that even his private defiance, this act of writing, will not be heard. And yet he continues. This is what makes Winston's struggle deeply human. Not his expectation of victory, but his refusal to surrender to silence. The knock at the door is a masterful device. It triggers a surge of existential panic. He imagines that they have come already, that the mere act of writing has summoned his doom. The reality is more banal. Mrs. Parsons, a neighbor, needs help with a blocked sink. But Orwell juxtaposes the mundanity of her request with the profound tension of Winston's internal state. illustrating how in a society built on suspicion, even the most innocent interaction carries the weight of potential betrayal. Mrs. Parsons herself is a subtle reflection of what happens to the spirit under the party's rule. Though only 30, she seems decades older, worn by fear and servitude. The dust in the lines of her face is not just physical, it is symbolic. She has been coated in silence, buried under the weight of expectations she cannot question. Her children, however, are the most chilling part of this encounter. When Winston is ambushed by the Parsons children, armed with a toy gun and accusations of treason, the scene is comical on the surface but deeply unsettling. The boy's words echo party slogans. His posture is aggressive, his eyes bright with zeal. This is not a child at play. This is a child performing his training, mimicking the violence he has been taught. The girl, younger, mimics her brother with equal enthusiasm. They are already transformed, no longer just children, but extensions of the state. The mother's fear of them is genuine. They're disappointed because they couldn't go to the hanging, she says half apologetically. The detail is grotesque, but Orwell's point is not sensationalism. It is to show how deeply the party's ideology has infected even childhood. Public executions are spectacles of loyalty, and children beg to witness them. Their education is not merely political, it is emotional. They are trained to love violence and hate mercy. And this, Winston reflects, is what terrifies him most. That these children, with their energy and passion, do not resist the party. They embrace it. They adore its rituals, its songs, its slogans. Their hatred is not rebellious, it is obedient. It is precisely because their emotions are strong that they are useful tools of oppression. All their ferocity was turned outwards, he thinks, against the enemies of the state. In this way, Orwell lays bare a devastating truth, that the most powerful tool of tyranny is not terror alone. It is the manipulation of love, loyalty, and innocence. Back in his flat, Winston returns to his diary, rubbing the fresh wound on his neck. A new military broadcast announces a fabricated victory, followed by a reduction in the chocolate ration. The cruelty of the moment is precise. Victory masks deprivation. The telescreen sings patriotic tunes to drown out hunger. And once again, Winston recognizes the emptiness behind the triumph. The war may not even be real, but the suffering is. He turns to the window. The word Eingesach flickers on a tattered poster. The principles of the party, newspeak, doublethink, the mutability of the past, surround him. They aren't just ideologies, they are architecture, environment, air. His world is built on lies so deeply embedded that even thinking clearly requires a kind of rebellion. And yet he continues to think. He remembers a dream years ago in which a voice whispered, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness." He has come to associate that voice with O'Brien, a man he barely knows, but to whom he feels a mysterious connection. Whether O'Brien is friend or foe doesn't matter. What matters is the feeling, the hope, that someone somewhere shares his questions, his doubts. The line, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness," is not just a dream. It is a prayer, a code, a flicker of faith. This is Winston's dilemma: to hope without reason, to trust without evidence, to resist not with weapons, but with thought. And he knows the cost. He was already dead, he writes. Thought crime is not the beginning of death. It is death. And yet, now that he has named it, he understands that what remains is survival. Not victory, but delay. Not resistance, but endurance. He writes a dedication to the future or to the past. From the age of Big Brother, greetings. This is not just sentiment. It is a statement of identity, of defiance. It is the quiet voice of a ghost who refuses to be erased. He understands that his words may never be read, that he will be caught, destroyed, forgotten. But that does not diminish their value. So long as he uttered it, Orwell writes, In some obscure way, the continuity was not broken. To speak even in secret is to remain human. The final act, scrubbing the ink from his fingers, placing a speck of dust on the cover of the diary, might seem small. But in Winston's world, where every action is monitored, every thought dissected, these gestures are monumental. They are acts of preservation, not just of the diary, but of himself. This is the heart of Orwell's message. In a world built to erase the individual, the smallest act of honesty becomes an act of revolution. Winston is not a hero in the traditional sense. He is afraid, he is fragile, but he is also awake. And in 1984, that alone is a radical thing. Because in Oceania, nothing belongs to you. Not your body, not your words, not even your memories. Except, perhaps, those few fragile centimeters inside your skull. And that is where freedom begins. In any age of fear, silence is not safety. To think freely, even in private, is already an act of rebellion. And to write what we truly feel, even if no one reads it, is to refuse disappearance. We live in a time where our minds are distracted, our thoughts harvested, and our truths often compromised for comfort. But Orwell whispers through Winston, your thoughts are still yours if you dare to protect them. And in that sacred, fragile space inside your own mind, freedom is not a slogan, it is a decision. Winston's first act of rebellion wasn't a protest, it was a whisper on paper. In a world drowning in noise, he dared to write the truth. As we close chapter 1, we're left with a question. In our reality of scrolling screens and smart devices, are we any freer than Winston was? If this episode sparked a thought, like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. In our next video, we'll uncover how even children can become instruments of tyranny in Orwell's world. Chapter 2 reveals the true cost of loyalty to the party. Let's keep the truth alive, one page at a time.